January 17, 1940. Dawn crawled over the frost-bitten airfield in northern France. Engines idled like restless beasts, their low hum vibrating through the frozen tarmac. Pilots crouched in leather jackets, goggles fogged from the cold, fingers brushing over controls, hearts tightening with anticipation. Above, a pale sun struggled through gray clouds, casting long shadows on rows of Spitfires and Hurricanes, lined like silent sentinels. Across the horizon, the enemy's reconnaissance planes traced patterns they thought invisible, unaware of the trap slowly unfolding below. In the command tent, a single figure studied maps and radio reports, calm yet calculating, a mind ready to bend the rules of expectation. Every movement, every order, carried weight, and in the still, biting air, a trick waited, poised to strike with precision no enemy pilot could foresee. The moment was fragile. The stage was set. The war was about to pivot. By early 1940, Europe had been locked in a tense standoff for months. The war, which had erupted with Germany's invasion of Poland in September 1939, had now spread across the continent. France and Britain were on high alert, anticipating the next move of Hitler's forces. The so-called phony war had created an uneasy calm. Shells had yet to rain on the Western Front, but behind the lines, preparations for a decisive confrontation were relentless. Intelligence officers pored over aerial reconnaissance photographs, decoding enemy troop movements, while airbases buzzed with activity under frost-laden skies. In northern France, the Royal Air Force had established forward positions to monitor German Luftwaffe activity across the border. Squadrons of Hurricanes and Spitfires, freshly delivered from Britain, were stationed in camouflaged hangars, engines kept warm in the cold mornings. Every sortie was carefully planned, every flight path mapped to maximize observation while minimizing exposure. Pilots, many barely in their 20s, trained rigorously for interception and reconnaissance missions. The tension was palpable. Each man understood that a single miscalculation could mean destruction. The Luftwaffe, meanwhile, had deployed fast reconnaissance aircraft and light fighters along the Belgian border. Their mission was simple: probe enemy defenses, gather intelligence, and test RAF responses. Yet their confidence was rooted in a crucial assumption. They believed Allied forces were predictable, reactive, rather than proactive. This underestimation would become a decisive vulnerability. Air combat in this period was defined by strict formations, carefully choreographed maneuvers, and limited technological support. Radar had been newly operational along the English coast, offering early warning, but still primitive in range and accuracy. Pilots relied on visual identification, hand signals, and radio communication under tense, sometimes chaotic conditions. The slightest deviation from expected patterns could create confusion, and confusion could be lethal. It was a delicate dance of speed, skill, and judgment, where a single mistake could tip the balance. The commander at the northern airfield, aware of both his squadron's strengths and the enemy's assumptions, began to plan with precision. Maps were studied in the small, dimly lit command tent. Reports from reconnaissance planes were cross-referenced with intelligence intercepted from German communications. Supply lines, fuel reserves, and weather patterns were all considered. Every variable mattered. Unlike many commanders who relied on brute force, he recognized that ingenuity, timing, and deception could achieve results no raw numbers could guarantee. For the pilots, the morning air carried more than frost. It carried the weight of anticipation, the unspoken knowledge that history could hinge on a single sortie. They moved through checklists, adjusted instruments, and exchanged terse, focused glances. Somewhere beyond the horizon, enemy pilots flew unaware of the trap forming, misreading the signs of the Allied presence. The tension was invisible but tangible, a silent battlefield stretching across fields and skies. In this quiet, calculated atmosphere, every element, the men, the machines, the intelligence, the environment, was aligned. The stage for a masterstroke of strategy had been meticulously prepared. And it was here, in these frost-bitten hours before the sun fully rose, that the first moves of a daring, unforeseen maneuver began. By mid-January 1940, intelligence reports suggested that German reconnaissance flights had increased along the northern French border. These probes were not random. They were calculated tests of response, measuring reaction times, patrol patterns, and coordination between radar posts and squadrons. Each overflight provided data that the Luftwaffe believed would give them an advantage in any future offensive. Yet, Allied commanders had begun to notice patterns, subtle, repeatable behaviors that hinted at overconfidence rather than efficiency. It was this perception that would become the opening for a decisive counter. The airfield itself was a hub of controlled chaos. Mechanics moved swiftly under the shadow of hangars, checking engines, replacing propellers, and fueling aircraft in a precise choreography honed by months of preparation. Pilots reviewed flight maps once more, memorizing waypoints and noting potential hazards, forests, rivers, small villages that might conceal anti-aircraft positions. Radio operators transmitted encrypted updates, confirming that radar had detected multiple incoming reconnaissance planes. Each alert was a pulse of tension, a reminder that the war above the clouds was just as deadly as the one on the ground. Beyond the airfield, the wider battlefield was in flux. French and British divisions had established defensive lines along strategic points, while the Germans continued to consolidate armored units further east. Supply routes were fragile, communication lines vulnerable. Commanders on both sides knew that a single misstep could cascade into disaster. It was within this fragile balance that air power could tip the scales. Air superiority was not yet absolute, but it was increasingly recognized as decisive, capable of shaping the movements of armies and influencing morale on both fronts. The RAF's northern squadrons, under the watchful eye of their commander, had a unique advantage: intimate knowledge of local terrain and weather patterns, combined with disciplined radio communication and innovative tactical thinking. The commander himself was known among colleagues as methodical, patient, and willing to take calculated risks. Unlike his counterparts who emphasized brute force or numerical superiority, he relied on deception, timing, and manipulation of expectations. Each sortie was not merely a patrol, it was a potential chess move in a larger, unfolding game. Meanwhile, enemy pilots continued to fly predictable circuits, confident in their ability to observe without being observed. They had little reason to suspect that the RAF would exploit assumptions with precision. The concept of a trap in plain sight had been considered too risky by many Allied commanders, yet here, meticulous planning had reduced that risk to near zero. Every component, the timing of takeoffs, the placement of aircraft, the use of terrain to mask movement, was calculated. Even the weather played a role. January mornings brought frost and low clouds, conditions that could ground some flights or force planes to adjust altitude unexpectedly. For the trained pilots and observant commanders, these limitations became tools rather than obstacles. Shadows, glare, and mist could conceal formations, create false perceptions, and heighten the psychological pressure on an unprepared enemy. By the end of this prelude, everything was aligned for action. The pilots ready, the aircraft maintained, the enemy unwitting, and the commander's plan fully formed. What was about to unfold would test skill, courage, and ingenuity, leaving a mark on the air war that few at the time could foresee. Human perspective. The pilots at the northern airfield were young, often barely out of their teens, yet their discipline and courage were extraordinary. Each man had been trained to act decisively under pressure, to respond instinctively to changing situations in the air. Frost stung their fingers as they checked controls, and the low hum of engines reverberated through their bodies like a pulse. Anxiety was ever present, but it was tempered by trust in their machines, in their training, and in the meticulous planning of their commander. These were men who understood the fragility of life in the skies. One miscalculation, one moment of hesitation could mean the difference between survival and destruction. Their human story was one of silent resilience, the quiet determination that underpinned every daring maneuver to come. Tactical perspective. From a tactical standpoint, the Northern Airfield was more than a collection of planes. It was a carefully orchestrated defensive network. Aircraft were positioned to allow rapid takeoffs, minimizing exposure to enemy observation. Squadrons were organized into formations designed for both interception and ambush, with flight paths calculated to exploit natural terrain features. Intelligence reports had revealed the enemy's standard reconnaissance patterns, and the RAF's response was designed to exploit predictability. Every movement, from taxiing to ascent, was synchronized with precision. The commander understood that tactical superiority was not solely about numbers or firepower. It was about anticipating the enemy's reactions, exploiting weaknesses, and creating opportunities for decisive engagement. Technological perspective. Technology shaped every decision in this winter of 1940. Spitfires and Hurricanes, though not yet the iconic instruments of dominance they would become, offered speed, maneuverability, and reliability. Radio communication was limited but effective, allowing squadrons to coordinate in real time under challenging conditions. Radar, still a relatively new innovation, provided early warning of incoming aircraft, though it required interpretation and experience to be truly effective. Even instruments as simple as compasses and altimeters were essential in executing complex aerial maneuvers. Pilots relied on their mastery of these tools, understanding how each machine functioned under strain, how weather could affect performance, and how precision in both technology and skill could transform a dangerous sortie into a calculated advantage. Leadership. Perspective. At the heart of the operation was the commander, a figure defined not by flamboyance, but by meticulous calculation and calm authority. He observed the airfield like a general surveying a chessboard, noting the position of every aircraft, the readiness of each pilot, and the subtle signs of fatigue or tension. Decisions were made with foresight, balancing risk with opportunity. He understood that in aerial warfare, as in all combat, the human element could not be ignored. A well-timed order, a carefully withheld instruction, or a calculated delay could be as lethal as any machine gun. His leadership was rooted in discipline, trust, and intuition honed through experience, enabling him to orchestrate maneuvers that exploited enemy assumptions without exposing his own forces to unnecessary danger. Enemy perspective. Across the border, German reconnaissance pilots believed themselves to be the hunters, confident in their speed, training, and superior knowledge of Allied positions. They flew repeated circuits over the northern countryside, interpreting the terrain, noting the placement of airfields, and recording every observation. Yet their assumptions were flawed. They expected predictable responses and underestimated the potential for ingenuity. This miscalculation created an invisible vulnerability, a window of opportunity for the Allies to exploit. The enemy's confidence, built on habit and procedural expectation, would soon be tested in ways they could not anticipate. Each pilot carried skill and discipline, but also a blind spot, a psychological gap created by overconfidence and routine that the commander intended to exploit. Moral and psychological perspective. The psychological dimension of the coming engagement was as critical as the tactical. Pilots, aware of the stakes but often removed from the political or strategic calculations behind the orders, relied on courage, trust, and quick decision-making. Fear was constant but controlled, a driver of focus rather than panic. For the commander, the moral responsibility was immense. The lives of young pilots rested on every plan, every maneuver. Deception and ingenuity were tools not merely of advantage, but of survival, designed to reduce unnecessary loss while achieving objectives. The interplay of human psychology, anticipation, and perception would become decisive, illustrating how the mind could be as formidable a weapon as any aircraft or machine gun. Bridging perspective, the unseen advantage. When these angles converge, the human skill of pilots, technological capability, tactical planning, leadership foresight, enemy misperception, and psychological pressure, the stage is set for a singular moment of impact. Every element, the frost-laden air, the shadowed runway, the humming engines, aligns with the commander's vision. The enemy, confident and unaware, moves into position. The Allied squadron, disciplined and coordinated, stands ready. What is about to unfold is not merely a battle of machines in the sky, but a confrontation of intellect, anticipation, and human courage. The tension is palpable, the outcome uncertain, yet meticulously prepared. It is here, at the intersection of preparation and opportunity, that the story approaches its turning point, the decisive moment when ingenuity overcomes expectation and a commander's calculated risk reshapes the battle. January 17th, 1940, mid-morning. The frost had begun to lift from the northern French airfield, but the cold still hung in the air, sharp against exposed skin. The RAF squadron readied itself for what appeared to be a routine interception. Engines roared to life, propellers cutting through the gray sky, creating a rhythmic pulse that echoed across the tarmac. Pilots climbed into cockpits with methodical precision, instruments checked, straps secured, goggles adjusted. Every man knew his role, every formation rehearsed in countless simulations and drills. Above the horizon, German reconnaissance planes traced their familiar circuits, unaware that their confidence was about to be used against them. They operated under the assumption that the Allied response would be predictable. A standard scramble, a defensive pattern designed to intercept or chase. The commander, however, had prepared an unorthodox maneuver. His plan was simple in concept but exacting in execution. Exploit the enemy's expectations, bend the apparent rules of engagement, and create the illusion of vulnerability while positioning his squadron for maximum advantage. As the first hurricanes lifted off, climbing through low-hanging clouds, the commander observed from the ground, timing each ascent with careful precision. Radar and spotters tracked the enemy's approach, feeding data through encrypted channels to the pilots above. The Germans, confident in their altitude advantage, had no reason to suspect that Allied planes were already maneuvering unseen beneath cloud cover. From the cockpit, the pilots felt the subtle tension of anticipation. Every adjustment of throttle, every shift in formation, was deliberate. The air seemed to thrum with potential energy, a silent prelude to confrontation. Then came the signal. A sudden change in formation, subtle enough to appear routine, guided the Hurricanes into a path that exploited terrain shadows and cloud cover. From below, it appeared as if the squadron was scattered, a disorganized response. In reality, each pilot was precisely where the commander intended, creating a concealed line of attack. The German reconnaissance planes, observing the apparent confusion, moved closer, believing they had gained the upper hand. Their sensors and visual assessments misread the positions, their confidence reinforcing the trap. From above, the enemy pilots saw what they thought was opportunity, a scattered, vulnerable squadron exposed to attack. They advanced, unaware of the Hurricanes waiting in concealed positions. The commander's trick relied not on brute force, but on anticipation, timing, and the disciplined execution of every moving part. Each pilot knew his role, every aircraft a calculated piece of a greater puzzle. The advantage of surprise, psychological pressure, and precise positioning converged in a single, decisive moment. As the first German planes reached the deceptive opening, the Hurricanes descended from hidden altitude, guns trained, engines screaming. Confusion erupted in the enemy formation. Maneuvers that were previously predictable became chaotic. Pilots reacted instinctively, attempting evasive action against a threat they had never anticipated. The commander's strategy was in full effect. Anticipation, deception, and flawless timing had turned expectation into vulnerability. In the span of moments, the tide of this encounter shifted. What had seemed a routine interception became a textbook example of tactical ingenuity. Yet the battle was far from over. The initial strike had set the stage for further maneuvers, and the consequences of the engagement were only beginning to unfold. The Hurricanes descended with precision, engines roaring, guns blazing. German reconnaissance pilots, caught off guard, struggled to maintain formation. One by one, their flight patterns fractured under the sudden assault. Smoke trailed from stricken aircraft. The sky streaked with tracer fire as chaos replaced confidence. The commander's calculated deception had created a momentary, but critical, window of advantage. What had appeared as routine dispersal was, in fact, a meticulously choreographed trap, leaving the enemy exposed at the exact point where the Hurricanes could strike most effectively. Above the battlefield, the rhythm of combat was stark and unforgiving. Pilots executed evasive maneuvers, weaving through clouds and the thin winter sun, yet every move had been anticipated. The commander had positioned his squadron not only for attack, but to cover one another, ensuring minimal losses while maximizing pressure on the disoriented enemy. Reports from the air revealed the effectiveness of the maneuver. Several German planes were damaged, some forced to retreat, and the reconnaissance objective of mapping Allied positions was thwarted entirely. The operation demonstrated the lethal intersection of planning, discipline, and deception in air warfare. From the ground, the tension was mirrored in the nervous movements of airfield personnel. Radio operators transmitted updates, mechanics watched through binoculars, and the commander calculated every unfolding movement. The initial engagement had been only the first phase. Secondary waves of Hurricanes swooped in to maintain pressure, keeping the Luftwaffe pilots off balance. Each sortie reinforced the tactical advantage, eroding enemy confidence. By exploiting predictable behavior, the RAF had transformed a reconnaissance mission into a decisive engagement, demonstrating that intelligence, timing, and ingenuity could outweigh raw numerical strength. The Luftwaffe pilots were now fighting not just for their mission, but to survive. Confidence had turned to confusion, then to desperation. Split formations struggled to regroup, and communication breakdowns left pilots isolated, vulnerable to coordinated strikes. Meanwhile, the Allied squadron maintained cohesion, moving in synchronized patterns that exploited both terrain and the enemy's disarray. The commander's foresight had anticipated every likely reaction, yet the speed and precision of execution remained critical. One hesitation could unravel the delicate balance. Within minutes, the skies above northern France told the story of controlled chaos. Smoke and tracer fire interlaced with the gray winter light. German aircraft that had approached with confidence now withdrew in disorder, forced to abandon reconnaissance objectives and retreat to safer positions. RAF pilots, while wary and alert, had sustained minimal damage, proof that the combination of tactical ingenuity and disciplined execution could dictate the terms of engagement even against skilled adversaries. Prone. Engagement ended not with dramatic spectacle, but with quiet calculation. The Luftwaffe was repelled, reconnaissance efforts foiled, and the Allied squadron returned to base with both pride and relief. The commander, observing reports from the ground and receiving updates from returning pilots, understood that this operation would be cited not merely as a tactical victory, but as a study in anticipation, psychological manipulation, and the strategic use of human and technological resources. In the aftermath of the maneuver, the immediate consequences were clear. The enemy had been forced to adjust patterns, delay missions, and question assumptions, while the RAF had demonstrated the value of disciplined deception. The skies of northern France, once merely a stage for reconnaissance, had become a proving ground for ingenuity and courage. Yet the story did not end in the air. The tactical brilliance of the day would reverberate in reports, strategic planning, and the morale of both pilots and commanders. The decisive moment, where expectation met calculated disruption, had passed. But the consequences of this engagement, both human and strategic, were only beginning to unfold. The skies above northern France had quieted, but the echo of engines and gunfire lingered in the minds of those who had taken part. Pilots returned to the airfield, faces streaked with grime, breaths visible in the cold winter air. There were no grand celebrations, only the silent acknowledgement of survival and success. Reports were filed meticulously. Several enemy reconnaissance planes were damaged, some forced to land prematurely, and their intended intelligence gathering had failed. RAF losses were minimal, a testament to both skill and the careful orchestration of the commander's maneuver. Mechanics and ground crews worked quickly to refuel and inspect returning aircraft. Every scratch on fuselage or wing panel was noted. Every report checked against flight logs. The commander moved among his squadron, reviewing details, asking precise questions about timing, formation integrity, and enemy reactions. There was satisfaction, but also measured caution. The day's success was significant, but it underscored the ever-present danger of aerial warfare. A single misstep could have turned a tactical triumph into a devastating loss. The human cost, though lighter than in larger engagements, was immediate and personal. Pilots grappled with adrenaline, fatigue, and the lingering awareness of how narrowly disaster had been avoided. In letters and diaries later examined by historians, many described the strange mixture of fear and exhilaration that accompanied the operation. For some, the event became a defining moment in their careers, a test of courage and composure under intense pressure. For the commander, it was validation of a principle he had long held. Ingenuity and anticipation could outweigh numerical advantage, and careful planning could protect lives even in deadly circumstances. Across the enemy lines, reactions were swift and unsettled. German intelligence noted the failure of reconnaissance and the unexpected resistance from what had been considered a minor airfield. Reports highlighted confusion among pilots, disrupted formations, and an inability to complete objectives. The Luftwaffe had underestimated the flexibility and creativity of the Allied command, and the incident would force adjustments in flight patterns, patrol timing, and engagement protocols. For the first time, confidence in predictable outcomes was shaken, revealing vulnerabilities that could be exploited in future encounters. Strategically, the operation sent ripples through both sides. Allied commanders recognized the value of deception combined with disciplined execution, while enemy forces had to reassess assumptions about predictability, observation, and response. In practical terms, the day's engagement delayed further reconnaissance in the area, giving the Allies temporary tactical freedom. It also demonstrated that mastery of timing, terrain, and psychological pressure could shape outcomes even in engagements where numerical strength was roughly equal. The moment had passed in the skies, but its consequences were only beginning to unfold. From pilot reports to command briefings, the engagement left a clear mark. Careful planning, anticipation of enemy behavior, and controlled execution could transform a routine sortie into a defining tactical victory. In the days following the engagement, the full significance of the operation became clear. German reconnaissance missions over northern France were temporarily curtailed, as pilots and commanders reassessed both the capabilities and ingenuity of the RAF squadrons. Reports emphasized unexpected formations, precise timing, and the use of terrain and cloud cover to mask aircraft positions. The Luftwaffe, previously confident in its ability to observe and anticipate, now confronted the reality of a more unpredictable enemy. Tactical doctrine began to evolve, with increased caution in reconnaissance patterns and additional training on response to potential deception. For the RAF, the victory carried both tactical and psychological weight. Pilots returned to bases with a renewed sense of confidence, understanding that disciplined execution, anticipation of enemy behavior, and clever maneuvering could decisively influence engagements. The operation became a reference point in internal briefings, illustrating how ingenuity could overcome apparent numerical parity. It also reinforced the importance of leadership. The commander's ability to coordinate, anticipate, and maintain control under pressure had been the critical factor in minimizing casualties while maximizing impact. Historians later noted that the engagement had broader implications beyond the immediate airfield. It demonstrated the potential of deception in aerial warfare, influencing Allied training programs and strategic planning. Squadron leaders emphasized simulation of enemy expectations and exploitation of predictable behaviors, creating a precedent for more sophisticated aerial tactics. Even brief engagements, when executed with precision, could shape enemy decisions, slow reconnaissance, and alter operational planning. The human consequences were also lasting. Pilots who participated carried the memory of that winter morning throughout their careers. In memoirs and oral histories, many reflected on the tension, fear, and exhilaration of executing a complex, high-stakes maneuver. Ground crews and support staff, often overlooked in official histories, also understood the significance. Meticulous preparation, timing, and attention to detail had turned routine tasks into essential contributions to success. Enemy reports, meanwhile, show a mixture of confusion and grudging respect. Analysts recognized that the RAF commander had exploited both predictable human behavior and technical limitations of their reconnaissance methods. For German pilots, the engagement served as a stark lesson in vulnerability. Even skilled airmen could be caught unprepared if their assumptions were exploited. This realization forced operational adjustments, contributing to a slower, more cautious approach in subsequent missions over Allied territory. By the end of January 1940, the engagement had left a measurable imprint on the broader conflict. Tactical victories like this, though small in scale, influenced morale, reshaped doctrine, and highlighted the decisive role of leadership and ingenuity in modern warfare. What had begun as a seemingly routine day of patrols and reconnaissance became a demonstration of calculated deception, disciplined execution, and human courage under pressure. The skies above northern France were calm once more, but the lessons of that morning, both human and strategic, resonated far beyond the airfield. The stage was now set for reflection on what this operation had meant in the larger context of the war, the men who flew it, and the enduring power of anticipation and ingenuity. The frost-laden skies of northern France had witnessed more than a tactical victory. They had revealed the power of foresight, discipline, and ingenuity in the chaos of war. The commander's maneuver was not merely a clever trick. It was a demonstration of how human intellect, anticipation, and courage could shape events as decisively as firepower or numbers. Every pilot, every mechanic, every calculation contributed to a moment where preparation met opportunity, and the unpredictable was rendered manageable through skill and resolve. This operation, though small in scale compared to larger battles, exemplified a timeless truth of warfare. Adaptability and anticipation often outweigh brute strength. Enemy assumptions, left unchallenged, can become liabilities. Confidence without caution is fragile. In exploiting these principles, the RAF demonstrated that victory often begins in the mind before it is achieved in the skies. For the men who flew that morning, the memory endured, not only the exhilaration of success, but the acute awareness of risk, the silent responsibility carried by each decision, and the weight of lives resting on disciplined execution. For history, the engagement serves as a reminder that even brief encounters can leave lasting influence, shaping tactics, morale, and the understanding of what it means to lead, to anticipate, and to act decisively under pressure. The skies eventually quieted, reconnaissance resumed, and the war pressed on. Yet the lessons of that day, ingenuity, precision, and courage in the face of expectation, resonated far beyond the frost-bitten airfield, echoing in the strategies, memories, and legacies of those who dared to think differently in the midst of conflict.